Hey. Today we're talking about ratios, rates, and unit rates. So we talked about this a little bit last year. We're going to get back into it and make sure everything comes back to us just like it was yesterday and spruce up our skills again. So put your name, date, and this big title at the top, and let's check out the notes that you also need to include. These are ratio, rate, and unit rate notes. First, ratios are comparisons of two basic values. So when you're comparing two values to each other, two different numbers to each other, you have a ratio. So every fraction is probably the most common or familiar example we have of this. So you can see that ratios can be written in three different ways, and one of them is in fractional notation. So I use variables here instead of specific numbers, but if A and B are both numbers, then if we're comparing them as a fraction, then we got a ratio going on. A to B, so comparing two values by saying there's 3 to 5 or 6 to 7, or I scored 3 points to your 9 points, then that's a ratio as well. And the final way is with a colon. Mr. Baird will like that one, and also me as a science teacher because he got a colon as well. Rates are comparisons of values with different units, so there's a little bit more. Ratios is just basic values. You don't have to have units, or maybe they might have the same units, but they're just basic values. Rates are comparisons of values with different units. So when I usually talk about fractions, we talk about pieces, so the pieces you're focused on to the total pieces, or parts to the total, parts that you have to the total parts. So rates is when you have different units. So a really common example of this can be seen with this car, my favorite car, the Mercedes-Benz CLK GTR. Feel free to contribute to the fund. That would help me one day drive one. That's for a different time. But miles per hour, and this car can do a lot of miles per hour, is an example of a comparison of two different units. So if you say, I drove 240 miles in 8 hours, well, then we can figure out how fast you were going. But that right there, 240 miles to 8 hours, that's a rate, because you have two different units. We're talking about miles and hours, and they're very different. Unit rates are also important here because in the example of miles per hour, we usually don't say I drove 240 miles in 8 hours. Rather, you would say I drove 30 miles per 1 hour. And that's more useful. If you say I drove 700 miles, isn't that fast? I don't know. Did you drive it over 7 weeks? Because that would not be very fast. If you drove it in a day, you were probably going pretty fast. So we like unit rates with a denominator of 1, talk about per 1 hour, because those are useful for comparisons. Last note we need to know a lot to do ratios, rates, and unit rates is that equivalent fractions can be made by multiplying or dividing numerator and denominator by the same value. So that should be familiar. I'm going to give you a little visual demonstration of that right here. Now let us say that we have this box, and let's say that I were better at drawing, so that all 4 of these were equivalent areas. These are equal parts. I think we could all agree that this would be 2 out of 4, 2/4. Now if I want to make an equivalent fraction, one of the things I can do is I can say, yeah, this is 2/4. That's the portion of that whole box that is shaded. But I could also divide. I could bring it down and just talk about it in simpler terms. And I could say if I divide this by 2, I said we used to have 2 areas shaded, but then I just split it and made it just 1. And there used to be 4 total spaces, but I just split it into 2. This is the same as 1/2. Notice the same portion is shaded, but now we're using different numbers to speak of it. Another thing that's important to realize is that I could split this back up into 4, and I could even split up even more. And I think you would agree that if you tried to count these different spaces, we now have 4 out of 8, because I took those two sections and I turned them each into 4. So I multiplied those by 4. And guess what? The one section that we were focused on, the one section that's shaded, that also got multiplied by 4. It got turned into 4. So whenever you multiply and divide numerator and denominator by the same thing, you're going to get an equivalent fraction. And that's good. We're going to use that a lot. Now let's go on to the examples. Please write these down and show the work just as I do. We're going to first write as a simplified ratio in all 3 ways. So we talked about 3 ways to write ratios. In all 3 ways, the statement, I pay $3 in taxes for every $9 I make. So the 3 ways to do that would be, say, this is 3 over 9, but this asks for a simplified ratio, so I know that I need to make this simplified because these are both divisible by 3. So I'll divide both by 3, and this is how I like to show that I'm making an equivalent fraction. We get 1 to 3. So I pay $1 in taxes for every $3 I make. Oh my goodness, isn't that the way the world is? The other ways to write this ratio would be 1 with a colon, 3, or 1, 2, 3. Doesn't that sound funny? 1, 2, 3. But 2 is a word. T-O. Second, write as a rate and unit rate. There are 18 girls and 9 guys. 18 girls. Now remember, rates do have units, so I'm going to include those here. 18 girls and 9 guys. We could do a simplified rate. I hope you can see that. And it would actually be 2 girls to 1 guy. And now that is actually our unit rate. 2 girls to 1 guy. We wanted to find out what's our denominator of 1. How do we get a denominator of 1 here? Well, we just had to divide by that denominator. We said 9 divided by 9 is 1. I need to also divide that numerator by 1. So we get 2 girls for every guy. Sounds like a Beach Boys song, because it is. If I was a party of 2 girls to every guy, I probably still couldn't get anyone to talk to me. Write as a rate and unit rate, number 3. I drove 189 miles in 3.5 hours. So you have 189 miles. So this is a rate because we had 2 different units. 3.5 hours, and I'm going to do it as a fraction. Of course, you could also do 5/10. So hours. Now we also want a unit rate. So there are a couple of different ways to do it here. Some people are just going to divide. They're just going to divide like normal. That's fine. That works. You could do that. Another way, if you want to think about this with me, this is why we'll do it now. Instead of just dividing 189 by 1, which would work, or by 3.5, which would work, because we would divide the denominator, we get 1 hour, and we divide the top by 3.5, 189. That would work. Another way I like to do this, because I know some people don't like to do with fractions, is if you double this. So let's multiply 3.5 times 2, we get 7 hours. But we also have to double our numerator. 189 times 2, try and do that mentally. It's like 190 times 2. That'd be 380, but we didn't have 190, we had 1 less in each group, each of our 2 groups. So we don't have 308, we have 378. And finally, to get our unit rate per 1 hour, how far are you driving? 378 divided by 7. Didn't this work? Beautiful. Oh my gosh. That'd be 5. Would give us 35. We'd subtract. We'd get 2 left over. Bring down an 8. Show my operation, unlike my students. 7 goes into 28 4 times. 28 subtracts. We get 0. Show my operation, unlike my students. So we get 54 miles per every hour. So hopefully you can see that. Make sure you have all these notes. Rewatch it if it didn't make sense. I'm going to leave you with some example problems as always. So here they are. Well, number 1 is to write as a ratio in 3 different ways the statement, one team has 30 points, the other has 12. So write that as a ratio 3 ways. Second, write as a rate and a unit rate. So you got to know what that means. He scored 190 points after playing 5 hours. Probably game and hardcore. So do your best. I will catch you.